Hello to all of you. There will be only a video this week, but I will talk about two ideas that appear in the second part of Mill utilitarianism and Mill's utilitarianism. So there are those two things are this. First of all, what motivates us? Why do we have what kind of reasons do we find to act morally within a utilitarian system? And the second one is happiness a good? So the first one goes this way. Why, suppose I say that utilitarianism claims that an action is good to the extent it promotes to happiness uh, to all people concerned by the action compared to all other alternatives. But what motivates me to act according to that action as long as I perceive that doing something contrary to it is going to benefit me? Actually, if you look on page 27, so the first page from the reading for this week, Mill says, if my own happiness lies in something else, why may I not give that the preference? So why would I act for the good of the community? Whew, a tough question to some extent, right? Well, there are various ways in which one can respond to this question, and I will say a few things about what Mill says and also some ways in which some other people may answer that. We first of all have to understand, Mill probably would say, or Mill actually says, what is to be a human being. If we consider human beings to be utterly independent, without any kind of connection with other human beings. So if we do not consider human beings social beings, then it may well be that happiness, individual happiness, is the one that I should pursue and not social happiness. However, Mill has an argument that is a fallacy actually, but nevertheless he has it. And in that argument, he claims that as long as I think about the good of the whole implies also the good of the individuals that form that whole. It is a fallacy because that's not correct. In the sense in which individuals, or the good of the whole does not imply immediately that the good of each part of the whole, each part of the whole also has good. So suppose I say, let's think about the body. If I say that the good of the body implies also that each part of the body will find happiness, I may get into a situation in which in order for me to survive as a body, I have to cut my hand because I am caught someplace and in a machine, and if I don't cut my hand immediately, then the machine will take my whole body and I will die. So for the good of the whole of the body, I have to cut the hand, which is pain for the hand. In the same way, in a society, I may conceive a situation in which the good of the whole implies also pain for a small number of people, which is, by the way, a problem with utilitarianism. But for Mill, the idea is that as long as I consider the good of the whole, I also consider the good of the part. So I would desire to have the good of society because I would know that that good also has influence on me. But how do I achieve that? Mill says, how do I achieve this idea of imposing the good of utilitarianism? Mill claims that utilitarianism will work in the same way as any other ethical theories work, and that is by having internal and external influences or internal and external requirements. How is that so? Well, if we get a sufficient number of people to believe in utilitarianism, and as long as they also think, because of that the good comes when we act in such a way that we produce happiness to produce more happiness over pain to all the people concerned by the action, then if I do not act according to this principle, I would feel pressure from my peers to do so, or I would feel as an outsider, and my desire to be present, my desire to be part of my society would encourage me to act according to utilitarianism. The other part is the internal part, and he says, that sometimes when I act contrary to ethical principles, I feel kind of strange. I feel bad about it. And as long as I acquire the idea that the principle of utilitarianism is a moral principle, then if I act against it, because I'm at a certain moment I desire something else that may not lead to the happiness of the whole, then I would feel a certain uneasiness. I would not feel good about me, which would lead me to try to act more according to utilitarian ideas. Okay, so that's one of the parts. So the first part, as I mentioned, is how do we get the principle of utilitarianism, or the principle of greatest happiness, to actually act for us. If we only think theoretically about, well, the greatest happiness principle and all that, but it doesn't have any influence on our lives, there is no point. And Mill believes that there is a way in which this principle can act on us, as I mentioned, by those two constraints, the external and the internal, and by the idea that anytime I achieve the good of the whole, I also achieve good of the individuals. Now, the other part is, what if happiness is not a good? How can we prove that happiness is something good? We read Aristotle, and Mill has done it too. And happiness, eudaimonia, is a good for Aristotle. And John Stuart Mill goes in a very Aristotelian way, because he claims, well, he says, well, if you talk about principles, and the greatest happiness is a principle, those principles cannot be demonstrated, because if they were to be demonstrated, they will have to be demonstrated with things that come prior to them, and those things would be the principles of the greatest happiness principle. So the greatest happiness will no longer be a principle, but something demonstrated by prior principles. If the greatest happiness is a principle, it can have no demonstration from other principles. I hope that makes sense. Let me think about how I can describe it differently. Oh, God is always a solution. Talking about God may always be a solution. If I claim that I can explain God by goodness, then goodness comes prior to God. And goodness would be the principle of God. And that would be impossible for me. In the same way in which I cannot explain that happiness with something else that comes prior to it. And he claims that the only way in which I can see that happiness is a good by seeing that people actually desire it. And, of course, people desire happiness, which makes it a good for John Stuart Mill. Is it a problem with this argument? Of course there is a problem, because people desire many things. People desire sometimes things that don't seem to be that good. And we transform actually the desire into a principle. But Mill doesn't talk about that. He just says people desire happiness, and because people desire happiness, that also shows that happiness is a good, and we don't need anything else for first principles, because for first principle, if you create another argument, then whatever you say in that argument becomes the principle. So that cannot be the case. So what would be another problem? Do people desire other things other than happiness? And Mill says, well, sure, they do desire virtue. But again, John Stuart Mill read Aristotle, and what is virtue? Is virtue not a part of happiness for Aristotle? Yes, it is. You may remember the three circles, the small one being contemplation, the larger one being virtues, and the largest one being the external goods. So the second circle was virtue, which was part of happiness, because all those three circles form happiness. So Mill will say, even if human beings desire other things, for example, virtues, all those virtues are actually part of happiness, which ultimately means that human beings desire happiness, which makes the greatest happiness principle the highest good, which also means that we should desire happiness, and in the way in which we produce happiness is by desire happiness for the group itself, because only in that way happiness will come on to each one of us. Is that a beautiful theory? Well, yeah, sure, why not? A little bit flawed, as I mentioned, but however, it suggests a few things that seem to be true from different perspective, and that is the fact that we rely on it, that we depend on one another. Inevitably, our lives are determined by the lives of other human beings, because we do not live just by ourselves. I mean, even now, just imagine right now, my life at this moment is determined by your existence, because if you were not exist, if you did not exist, if you did not take this course, I would not have done this video, right? So I at the same time, your life is determined by my life, because if I didn't exist, you would see it somebody else maybe speaking on this phone and so on. And that suggests that indeed, we cannot decide happiness just individually. However, the problem with Mill is that this idea of measuring happiness in units of pain and units of pleasure, because inevitably he introduces a new principle, and that is the measuring of happiness. How do we measure happiness? Do we measure happiness individually? And if we measure happiness individually, does it mean that my happiness will be different than yours, or would I get more units of pleasure from an action more than you? And what would be the criteria for those units? Would it be the way in which I perceive the units of pleasure I get, or the units of pleasure you get? So anyway, things get messy with utilitarianism, as you know probably by now. But those are probably, or not probably, let me put it this way, those are the two ideas I wanted to talk about in connection with Mill. Obviously there are many more. Please remember that for this week you have to write papers, and you can choose to discuss one of these topics, or you can choose to discuss another topic, because there are other topics in the readings for this week. Enjoy your week, and see you next Friday or Saturday. Bye, take care.